Protests over food and fuel, not something usually associated to Europe or Western countries, but that is not the case anymore, for it looks like it has become the norm. Protests have surged in Europe, like in France, where the French protested against pension reform, similar to protests in Spain, Germany, and can't forget the UK. But at the heart of these protests is a sentiment of insecurity that people are feeling, and that's over the cost of living as a whole. In this edition of The Spotlight, we will look at how long this crisis will last for Europe, and for how much longer will the politicians of these countries divert funds to things like the Ukraine conflict instead of their own people. First, let me introduce our guest for this edition of The Spotlight. Keith Philbin, Professor of International Economics and Finance at City University, joins us from London. Also joining us from London is Robert Olds, Executive Director at Impact International. Welcome to you both. Robert Olds, I'll first start with you. What is going on in Europe when you take a look at protests for basically the cost of living? I'm starting out with a general question because this is what the stat reads, that there was an unprecedented global wave of more than 12,500 protests across 148 countries, okay, as a whole, not just Europe, we're talking as a whole. And that's over food, fuel, and the cost of living increases. This was recorded for the year 2022. But the largest ones were in Western Europe. Why is that?
Well, Western European countries were running an economic model which was basically built upon cheap labour, keeping wages low. So there was the suppression of labour. There was also the easy supply of money. Interest rates were kept low, and government spending and borrowing was high. But that created inflationary pressures. Now we had that inflationary pressures came to bear with, of course, the mass printing of money that came with the measures to relieve the COVID problems, which were, of course, generated mainly by actually the lockdowns which are put in place, and the governments are throwing out money. That was always going to create inflation. Now, of course, add in the increased cost of fuel and gas as a result of the Ukraine conflict, and then, of course, the profiteering from energy companies, and in a situation where people's wages were already artificially kept low, then, of course, we have people in real economic difficulties, low wages, high cost of living. There's only one thing that's going to happen there, and that's going to be further economic problems, but also politically, it will mean there will be protests. So that's where we are now. Really, it's a result of policies which go back a long time in history, many decades, where, of course, inflation was artificially low because of unit labour costs in the Chinese economy, and they could supply products at a very low rate, and that artificially looked like inflation was low. But of course, actually, places like Britain, house prices were shooting up because the government, when it was artificially producing money, printing money, creating it out of thin air in many cases, that just in a sense created a situation, a world where house prices and asset costs were shooting up, but people's wages were not keeping up. And so, of course, there was always going to be a situation where the situation would fail and people would then protest. And that's what we're seeing now.
All right. Well, if you want to take a look at this overall, Keith Philbin, I think our guest there, Robert Olds, painted, I'm guessing, an accurate picture. And we could just wrap up this program and call it the night or the day, wherever you may be. But let's get into some of the countries and see where things stand. For example, in France, we're looking at a fifth day of these nationwide strikes. It's about these pension reform retirement age, or pension reform, which wants the retirement age to increase from 62 to 64. Now, I'm guessing also at the heart of this, we're looking at a cost of living that people are obviously coming out to relay their sentiments on that. What are we looking at when we're taking a look at France, in this case in point?
Well, what we're looking at in the West, actually, as well as France, is ageing populations and whether governments can continue to support you into your old age with a generous pension. And let's be honest, in France, they're raising it from 62 to 64. But in the UK, for example, we're raising it from 65 to 68. So it's a different ballgame. So in some ways, the French are behind. But the reality is that the welfare state in the West has grown excessively large, and it's not sustainable, and public finances are not sustainable. It's absolutely clear that there is a very rich, people have become very rich, some of them, and other people haven't done very well, okay, which is the many in a way. And ultimately, this is about income distribution from the rich to the others, because that's the position we're in. And it's a common problem across, the G7 economies, I would say. Not just France, UK, United States has got a demographic problem as well. Not to the same extent, though. So the question is reality. And I think the solution will be targeting. You see, there's no need to give multi-millionaires that own lots of land and whatever pensions, to be honest. We've got to relook at universal benefits because it's unsustainable, the current system. It's as simple as that. And governments have to actually decide how to allocate money, which is scarce.
All right.
And they seem incapable of doing that.
So you're targeting universal, I guess, expenditure there. But I get the feeling that you're just focusing on that. But how about having the government increase its revenue through other means, not just, for example, taxes, but generate revenue, whether it's investments in the country or what have you? Are European countries lacking that confidence in just one example that I just stated?
Well, public finances are tight because, as your previous speaker said, they borrowed lots of money and a lot of it was wasted, of course. This is the worst thing. When they borrowed huge amounts for COVID, so much of it was wasted on excessively generous furlough schemes in many countries. Right. They were excessively generous. They stopped people working in order to qualify for COVID. I mean, it's a completely stupid thing to do. PPE equipment, well, wasted. Lots of money was wasted. People could have gone back to work much quicker, with proper protections. So there was tens of billions wasted.
Okay.
And that's the problem. You haven't got that money now, you see, because we've already spent it. We've already increased the national debt, and we've printed, as your previous speaker said, far too much money, and that's now causing inflation. It was fantasy land. You can pay for everything by printing money, and that's going to do good for the economy. It's fantasy economics, always has been, and always will be.
All right, Robert Olds, to round up France, if you can please give us your idea as to what's going to happen in that country. We're looking at the reform that Emmanuel Macron wants to push through to raise that retirement age from 62 to 64. We're still looking at a cost of living crisis somewhat in that country. And of course, we're looking at what France, just like many other countries, had a furlough scheme that was very generous. But moving forward, how is it going to be able to deal with this? I mean, he himself has come out and said that if we don't get this reform in place, the government's going to have a very tough time trying to meet its obligations in terms of its budget or what have you. I'm trying to look at what Emmanuel Macron has said. So what are your thoughts on France?
Well, the French are not afraid to protest. They never have been. In fact, have a history of doing so. So there's protests, there's strikes, even more than what's in the UK. There are measures in France to try and restrict the strikes, and of course the protests, and in some cases there can be some quite brutal policing. The French still will take to the streets. There was originally the Yellow Vest movement in France, which was driven by Emmanuel Macron, the president, putting up taxes, particularly on fuel, and really targeting the middle class people in France, people who are, in a sense, those who are the squeezed middle, as we would call them in the UK, those who are not poor enough or destitute enough to be reliant on benefits, but then not wealthy enough to be able to afford higher taxes. And so they've been squeezed, they've been pushed around, they've been really squeezed till the pip itself squeaked, to coin a phrase. Now, what we're going to see in France is further problems. Their economy possibly will grow over 2023, but at a very low rate. It's probably Germany is the only really significant country in Europe that will be suffering a recession. Britain is thankfully out of the recession, but France is going to have more and more difficulties, and really they won't be able to there isn't the political headroom in France for people to tolerate any more measures, such as reducing the state pension, or indeed increasing the age at which people qualify for the pension in France. That will be met with protests. People will just not tolerate it. So there's going to be some severe economic difficulties. But to come to the UK, yes, there are problems. There is the cost of living crisis in Britain, which has largely been driven by higher fuel costs. But at the same time, Centrica, the company that owns British Gas and supplies much of gas to British homes, has made record profits. There is a problem here of an economic model which is not really a free market. It's rent-seeking companies, corporations who need to be broken up, monopolies that need to be smashed, cartels that need to be broken, just like Teddy Roosevelt did in the United States in the early 20th century. That's what needs to happen here, because there's not competition. And so companies are just at will to put their prices up. We need to have some monopolies broken here and some cartels smashed.
Good point.
And to have a re-energized economy, which is competitive, which has a real free market and has consumers having to have choices, not companies exploiting their unfortunate customers.
Sure. Keith Bilbin, our guest talks about an economic model there. I think it's called greed. And if you want to really round it up, but it has been termed as greedflation in terms of the corporate profits that are being made. And of course, the whole idea about this monopoly is something that has been discussed. I'm sure you're well aware of that. Record profits raked in by these companies. But first, why weren't they stopped? Why, or were they? Has it been successful? And how much of a difference would that make? The impact would have on the cost of living in the case of the UK, for example?
Well, the government has imposed taxes, windfall taxes on these firms. And, you know, they're going through good times at the moment, but a few years ago, price was a lot lower and they weren't making profits. So I don't think you can have it both ways. We need to have a system that is fair and equitable over time. So they're having good times at the moment, but this is due to the surge, all right? So it's not necessarily corporate greed, and and windfall taxes also send the wrong message, because it means, you know, if you're successful, make loads of money, we'll suddenly impose windfall taxes, which is not what you want. But this government is pretty incompetent in the way it basically manages virtually any issue. And so I don't agree that, you know, these windfall profits should necessarily something to worry about, because as that price is coming down, and we've seen that in the wholesale, those profits will come down automatically with it.
Okay.
But of course, it doesn't sit well with people when they're suffering the biggest fall in living standards, you know, since the Second World War. I mean, and Britain is not in a good state. We've narrowly avoided a technical recession, but we've also got the additional burden of Brexit, which is wasted money in the hundreds of billions. It's in the hundreds of billions.
Right.
And of course, that's leaving less money for public finances. A smaller economy means smaller tax state. And that means you have to be tougher with the state workers.
Okay.
So we're in a complete mess. Any idea that we're in any better shape than Germany is delusional.
Okay. Well, Robert Ould, if you have a response there to our guest, Keith Bilbin.
Well, the wholesale gas price has actually come down. It actually came down in the autumn quite substantially, yet cost reductions were not passed on to consumers. Companies, because they could get away with it, because people find it hard to switch, and because there isn't really much choice, because energy companies really do, it seems, operate as if they're in a cartel. The energy companies didn't pass on the savings to their consumers, who, of course, now are still having to pay a high amount for energy. So really, that's the situation where we have. And when it comes to Brexit, well, actually, British inflation in terms of food prices is actually lower than that in the Eurozone, and actually lower than that in the EU. So really, there hasn't actually been this economic harm done by Brexit. In fact, quite the reverse. It's Germany that is in recession.
Okay.
Britain has just about narrowly
Let's talk about
avoided
Germany.
it. And we'll, of course, bounce along the bottom for the 2023. But from 2024 onwards, we should actually see some growth returning.
Yeah, I know that Brexit, and I saw your reaction, Keith Bilbin, we just really have to cover Europe. I don't want to be stuck in the UK. So let's move on. and I'd like both of you to obviously have your input on Germany, because Robert Olds there, Keith Bilbing, talks about how Germany is going to go into a recession, unlike other European countries, but Germany is the EU's powerhouse. How much of an effect, an impact will that have on the EU as an organization? And of course, why is that? Do you agree?
Well, Germany has been much more affected by the rise in oil and gas prices. It's actually got a much bigger manufacturing sector for starter and a much bigger dependence on Russian oil and gas, and has had to seek replacements at world prices, much more severely affected than Britain. So you can't conclude anything about the inflation, because of course it's going to be bigger in Germany as a result of a much more dependence on oil than the UK and gas. So we can't make those kind of comparisons. And Germany, of course, is also stuck in this sort of manufacturing. It is not moved to become the service sector economy like the UK. So it's got its own problems, and also lacks, the investment that is needed. Really, look at the US economy; it's been doing pretty well throughout all of this crisis. And doing, pretty well on economic growth, because they're in growth sectors. They've got all these service sector companies that are still doing well, technology and stuff. And Germany, to be honest, has not been doing as well as it used to. I mean, that's it. It's also had the additional burden, of course, of, levelling incomes across Germany between the East and the West.
All right. So, Robert Olds, here we are. We're looking at inflation of the European Union at a record number at 11.5%. At the same time, real wages have fallen behind. Based on one particular source, maybe this source is stretching it, but it says that in every EU member state this year, it's referring to the year 2022, that it was by as much as 9% for real wages to have fallen. I'm not too sure how accurate that is, but it kind of gives an idea of how bad things are. It's all about wages and how they have not kept up with the pace of inflation. So what is there to do? Is there one size fit all answer that we can give here, or should each economy of these European countries be looked at differently?
Well, when it comes to the European Union, yes, there is this cost of living crisis across the whole of Europe. There's also another problem. It's not just about energy prices affecting the German economy, although that is indeed very significant. You had Germans actually taking to the woods to collect wood to use in firewood, because they couldn't actually afford to be paying the electricity and gas costs. There's another problem as well, and that's a lack of creativity, a lack of inventiveness, and lack of competitiveness, and just really using the European institutions to make the rules that restrict new entrants coming into the marketplace, just to reward the big, powerful corporations that are already in place. And Germany benefited from that from quite a long time, but they're paying the price now, because Germany bet very heavily, German manufacturers bet heavily on diesel, for instance. Well, that technology is now outmoded and politically unacceptable, and socially unacceptable as well. But there isn't really a big European electric car maker. There just doesn't exist. There's in China, there is in the United States. There isn't a big European technological
I'm sorry for jumping
company.
in. I got to squeeze in this question for Keith Bilbing, because we're just almost out of time. Keith Bilbing, in under a minute, we're looking at France. The union has said we'll bring the country to a standstill with our protests. We're looking at the UK. Another strike action is going to take place in the coming week, along with all the other ones that keep increasing in numbers. How are the respective governments of these countries feeling the danger of people power? And is there a threshold that may be passed, will be too late for the government to deal with the people coming out in masses? Less than a minute, please.
Well, in both countries, the governments can make further concessions. Ultimately, there is more money that can be borrowed, and if that helps through the crisis, then that's what they'll end up doing. But they do need to think of other policies as well. Wealth taxes should be very high on the agenda, because, we've got the state in a very bad financial state, and yet
we need growth.
A lot of
That's what we need, growth and creativity, and companies that respond to their consumers and the public, rather than just exploit the population.
Thank you. We're going to have to end it there, Robert Olds. We appreciate that. Executive Director at Impact International. And Keith Pilbeam, thank you, Professor of International Economics and Finance at City University, both from London. Thank you to you both. With that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. From Ika Vitagwe and the team, it's goodbye.